Silent, White and Beautiful by Tod Robbins. Tomorrow at this time I shall be dead. I have repeated this phrase over and over since breakfast, with the utmost calmness, with the utmost resignation. In no way have I attempted to blind myself to the truth. He who does that is lost. The philosopher alone is wise. Before the clear, calm eyes of reason, the imaginary terrors of dissolution become infinitesimal specks of dust. I breathe upon them, and they are gone. And yet I cannot visualize my death. I have tried to many times, but have failed. Sitting down on the left-hand corner of my cot, I attempt to picture the execution. My imagination has always been supernaturally acute. I can see the room and the chair dreaded by so many, and the witnesses, yes, I can see them, all those sensation mongers. There is one fat old gentleman in a striped flannel waistcoat, an old gentleman who keeps on smiling and smiling. One would think he were at a wedding, his smile is so forced and unreal. And the others are like statues, grouped together to represent something. Yes, I can see them all, but they are not looking at me. No, they are looking at another man, a man who has seated himself in the chair. But this man is not I. No. Though he sits in my place, wears the new suit which was given me, bears my dishonored name, he is not I. And although I attempt to analyze this man's emotions, read the secret workings of that brain, understand the feelings of one in the shadow, the blade of imagination bends in my mind, becoming useless and dull. Tomorrow at this time I shall be dead. This phrase no longer conjures up anything, like a child who has repeated the Lord's Prayer over and over. So have I repeated, tomorrow at this time I shall be dead, till the words have become meaningless, sinking back into the unexplored caverns of sound. And that this hand which guides the pencil, this live human hand, will in so short a space be motionless and powerless, cold and senseless, seems as impossible as the wildest dream. The voice of reason pounds dully against my eardrums, but cannot gain admittance. Perhaps it is better so. Am I afraid of death? No. Then why have I taken up the pencil? Because although I am not afraid of death, I am afraid of something which lurks on the invisible frontier, something which is quite apart from both life and death, something which reads my words, my looks, my gestures. And because of this silent sentinel in my cell, I have become a stranger to myself, an uncouth, awkward stranger. The egotist has fled, the artist who crushed conventionality beneath his heel, and in his place stands an unknown, terrible fellow, a fellow who needs watching. I could have pleaded insanity at my trial and escaped the chair. It is so easy for me to act, but now, why could not the judge and jury see me now? But I must not peer too long into my soul. Introspection looks down the shaft and soon sees the grinning face of madness floating on the black water. The austere countenance of the philosopher casts back her reflection which she recognizes with a shudder. The moon may be, but I must not wander. One source of solace has been with me constantly during my days of imprisonment. To a man such as I, a man condemned to death, the daily newspapers are of great value. It is comforting to realize that there are thousands, nay, millions of human beings who are cognizant of my existence, perhaps intimately interested in the outcome of my career. During these last few weeks, as never before, I have felt myself to be an important link in the human chain, a link which daily holds the attention of a multitude of minds. I, the unknown sculptor, the young man of limited means and limited reputation, am now something of a celebrity. What an enduring hold has egoism. I got myself smiling a self-satisfied smile when I wrote something of a celebrity. Avaunt, false stride. You are in the presence of the shadow. Back to the highway of life, where the multitudes sit in the sunlight. I have no need of you here. I realize perfectly what a storm of curiosity my actions have aroused, and it is not my purpose to leave this planet without a satisfying answer to the question which I myself have raised. You, who have so often studied my striking portrait in the papers, you who have puzzled over my whimsical acts during the ill-fated month of March, you, my friends and admirers, shall learn of everything which prompted me to a series of crimes destined to set the world of sensation agog. And you, my fair readers, you, whose soft cheeks so quickly change from rose to lily, you, who shudder and turn away, look again into the face which you have covertly abstracted from the newspaper, the face of René Gallien, your humble servant. René Gallien, who created that group, the Happy Family. Respect is akin to fear, is it not? You shall respect me. I come from an old French family. There is the blood of kings in my veins. You smile, but it is the fact, I assure you. Have you not noted in my many portraits the finely chiseled features, the aristocratic curl to the lips, the small shell-like ears? But my hands, they are what tell the story. The long tapering fingers, the delicacy of wrist and palm, yes, these are the hands of one refined by the gradual process of centuries. Why do my eyes hold your attention, then, when I have such hands as these? After the Revolution, my great-grandfather emigrated to America. Since then, the Galliens have been bobbing up and down like corks. You know how it is. 1 year a mansion, servants, horses, dogs. Another year a boarding house, genteel respectability. A single suit shiny at the elbows and knees. That comes from an excess of aristocratic blood in a plebeian age. The male members of my family have never been saving with their money. My father cried out on his deathbed, "It is glorious to die in debt. One has succeeded in cheating one's enemy, the world." A strange man was he, with a laugh like the cackling of a frightened hen, and dry, shriveled hands, which rustled in the empty pockets of his frock-coat like banknotes. My mother died before I can remember. At an early age I was sent to school in Paris. Once a year I was allowed to cross the sea and visit my father in New York. He would meet me each time at the pier, looking very sombre in his frock-coat. I remember that towards the last his face seemed as yellow as the pale, bloodless oranges one buys. He resided at a small boarding house in 33rd Street, a French boarding house where one encountered all manner of odd characters. Madame Fabienne, the landlady, was a woman well on in middle life. At the time of which I speak, she attempted to maintain a semblance of youth by a plentiful use of cosmetics. Her face, as haggard as a death's head, had a vivid splash of colour beneath each prominent cheekbone, and above it her hair, yellow and fuzzy, reminded me of sun-dried weeds. Her eyes were a bitter blue, but they softened when they looked upon my father. In some way, perhaps by his glib tongue and polished manners, he had wormed himself into the landlady's good grace. The pitcher of cream always stood beside his place at the breakfast table, and, when he came to die, for many nights she went about the house mewing like a sick cat. No doubt with him was buried the last romance of her checkered career. Perhaps the realization of this added to the poignancy of her grief. Madame Fabienne had a daughter of about my own age, who did much to make my visits to New York agreeable. She was a pretty, vivacious child, with a mind far too precocious for her years. Looking through keyholes had given one of her eyelids an unconscious droop. She had made herself the bane of the boarder's existence. It is needless to say that what youthful innocence a French boarding school had left me vanished after a month's sojourn at Madame Fabienne's. After my father's death, I returned to Paris with a letter of introduction to an old friend of the landlady's, a certain Paul Montaigne. He was a successful sculptor of the period, a man who, if he had not been addicted to drugs, might have reached high places. From the first I loved him. There was something restful in his companionship, something which reminded me of a calm autumn day. He gave me the key which opened the door to a new resplendent world. Art was his mistress. She soon became mine. Before long, I too could see the beauty in ugliness, the joy in tears. If he had lived, what might I not have done? Paul Montaigne adopted me. I posed for him. I swept up the studio. I enlivened him when he was plunged into one of those fits of melancholy which followed his excesses. In return for this, he taught me his art. I was an apt pupil. Soon I conceived several small pieces of my own, which I sold on the Paris streets. Once a week I took my stand on the Rue Montmartre and peddled my wares to any passer-by. One afternoon I returned to the studio and found my benefactor dead. He was lying at the feet of a statue upon which he had been working, a statue representing justice. His body seemed to be in an attitude of supplication. A thin ribbon of blood crawled towards the door like a miniature river of red. He had cut his throat. It seemed unbelievable at first. When I saw him lying thus, I felt that I had lost everything in the world. Dropping the bag which contained several tiny statues I had not sold, I sank to my knees and began to blubber like a baby. There the concierge found me an hour later, sobbing as though my heart would break. After Paul Montaigne's death, I returned to America. It seemed to me that I could make my fortune there much more readily. Surely in the United States competition was not so great. My 4 years with the sculptor had given me a foundation few could boast of. Montaigne had often told me that I possessed a talent which was in no way inferior to his own. It was with high hopes that I set sail from France. On arriving in New York, I took a cab to the familiar boarding house. Madame Fabienne opened the door for me. I scarcely recognized her. In the 4 years which had elapsed, she had become an old hag and looked every day of 60. After my father's death, she had evidently buried her cosmetics. Her face, wrinkled and yellow, was so thin that the sharp protruding cheekbones seemed at any moment about to penetrate the skin. Her scanty hair was now splotched grey, and she leaned heavily on her cane in the doorway, reminding me of the witches in Macbeth. But her eyes had not changed. No, they were that same bitter blue. Now they looked at me suspiciously from beneath a ragged boudoir cap. "Way," said she. "Is this Madame Fabienne?" I asked, suspecting that my memory had played me tricks. "Yes, this is Madame Fabienne. What is it you wish of me, young man?" "I am René Garlien," I answered, stepping forward. "Do you not remember me?" "Mon Dieu!" The old woman's expression changed from suspicion to joy. She tapped me playfully on the shoulder with her cane. "Come in, come in." "Of course it is René. Why, you are your father over again. The same carriage of the head, the same air distingué. Only the eyes are different. But come to these old arms. I have heard such things of you from Paul. You are the great sculptor now. Is it not so?" In spite of an inner qualm, I submitted myself to the old hag's embraces. She pinched my cheeks with fingers as yellow as sticks of cinnamon. She rose on tiptoe to press her lips to my forehead. She smoothed my silky hair with the palm of her hand, a palm which was as rough as a nutmeg grater. She was like the cracked, dusty vase in which lies buried the trampled rose leaves of the preceding spring. Once the vessel of desire, she had been quaffed to the very dregs. "Louise will be delighted to see you, René," she said, leering up at me. "Ah, you blush, eh? You remember her? The little cat that she was. But now, how she has changed. Like you, she has grown tall and beautiful. And such a figure. The art students draw her twice during the week. How the pencils shake in their hands, how their eyes stare and stare. They are like men in a trance, so beautiful is she." "Is she a model?" I asked. "Yes, but there is none other like her in New York. When my last boarder left, it was necessary that she do something. We must live, is it not so? But I will tell her that you are here. She will be overjoyed." Madame Fabienne hobbled down the passageway, leaving me standing in the hot, stuffy hall. As I watched her figure receding in the shadows, I made up my mind to remain in her good graces. I had been barely able to scrape up enough money in Paris to pay for my passage. I was now in a well-nigh penniless condition. Of course, I would soon be successful, but in the meantime, I must not neglect any slight smile of fortune. Before the old woman returned with her daughter, I had made up my mind to be enthusiastic. Louise did not make my role difficult to play. She had indeed matured into a kind of rare, if sulky, beauty. Her full lips, although pouting and discontented, were still inviting, and although her figure was rather buxom according to my standard, still there were men who would have thought it perfect. My raised hands and upturned eyes, therefore, while delighting both mother and daughter, even to myself had no savour of the ludicrous. "Is she not changed?" asked Madame Fabienne. "Changed?" I cried. "Why, she is transfigured." Louise blushed and smiled. Evidently I had pleased her. "You yourself have altered for the better," she said, looking at me quaintly. "You are no longer the ugly duckling." I murmured a graceful acknowledgment, then, turning to her mother, immediately reverted to the point in hand. "Do you still take boarders?" I asked. "If so, I would consider myself fortunate in securing—" "Most certainly you may board here," the old woman answered. "At present there is no one, and we can give you the better attention. My fees are moderate to the son of an old friend." Again Louise smiled, disclosing 2 rows of large white teeth. "Follow me," she said, picking up my valise in spite of my protests. "I will show you to your room." Madame Fabienne leered at me as I passed her. She again reached up and pinched my cheek. It nauseated me. Without the slightest compunction, I could have put my hands on her weed-like throat and choked the life out of her. Even then, I felt that she and I could not live under the same roof without disastrous results. I hesitated for a moment on the landing before I followed Louise up the creaking staircase. "I must break off for the time. Father Flynn has been shown into my cell. Why does he insist on offering ghostly consolation to me? Can he not realize that I am a man of adamant will, of unshakable determination? This priest in the sunshine dares to come to me in the shadow, dares to come to me and cry, 'See, there is everlasting life.' Everlasting life, bah! Rather everlasting death with its calm immobility, everlasting death with its enigmatic smile. Yes, there I will be, reigning like a mountain peak, cold, still, and thoughtful. But now Father Flynn is approaching. His long black robe brushes over the floor of my cell with a swishing sound. His solemn eyes are fixed upon my face. About his neck a crucifix is suspended. Christ hangs on this crucifix, tiny, weak, and helpless. Christ made into a doll. When he speaks of life everlasting, I shall point at his toy Christ and laugh. Father Flynn has left me. His brain, heavy and ponderous as a medieval battle-axe, was no match for the lightning thrusts of mine. I have hurt him in a sensitive spot beneath his armour of religion. I have penetrated his self-esteem. He now doubts himself, which is far worse than doubting God. Like an old woman who suddenly encounters a mouse in her bedroom, like an old woman with dragging skirts and downcast eyes, he has hurried from the cell. In his opinion, I am eternally damned, a man for whom the jaws of hell are yawning. I have refused to reverence the doll dangling from his neck. Therefore, I am as one lost. Poor old man, I pity him for his childish credulity. What I envy him is simple trust. But if I had had a Christ, if I had had a sacred symbol of something greater than myself, I would not hang it about my neck and be content. No, I would build for it a pedestal, and on this pedestal I would place it so that it could sneer down on the passing people, sneer down on the passing people in the dust. And in its eyes would be hot anger. and in its hands a reeking sword. Away with your tiny toy Christ, Father Flynn. Mine would be gigantic and terrible. Gigantic, terrible, and red. But I must compose myself. Already night stretches out her ebony wings over the world. When the first rays of dawn creep into my cell, they will come and take me away. Meanwhile, death is waiting in the corner. He alone does not fear me. He alone can return the look in my eyes. Before that grim sentinel my glance wavers and falls. I will take up the pencil and finish my record. Yes, although the pitiless spectre continues to stare at me with his dull, lackluster eyes. When I took up my residence with Madame Fabienne, I intended remaining there only a short time. It seemed to me that my genius would find recognition before many weeks went by. In the meanwhile, it was necessary for me to live, and where could I live on credit except at Madame Fabienne's? The old Frenchwoman ensconced me in a large room on the topmost floor, a room which had once served as an artist's studio. It had a north light, and was in every way suitable for a workshop. I had brought over with me from Paris the tools of my trade, and it was not long before I started working in dead earnest. Ere a month went by, I had created several miniatures, which I thought I could dispose of for a fair sum. My moments of leisure were spent with Louise and her mother. I felt it necessary to keep in the good graces of both women, but what a bore it was! My flesh fairly crawled when Madame Fabienne touched me. It was as much as I could do to submit to her caresses. And then the atmosphere of the house began to get on my nerves. It was so hot and stuffy downstairs, and a sweet, sickening odour hovered about everything. In the parlour there were a multitude of photographs representing Madame Fabienne in her youth. She had evidently been a vaudeville performer of versatile repertoire. There were pictures of her walking a tightrope, a parasol above her head, smiling sentimentally at space. Pictures of her in knickerbockers riding an old-fashioned bicycle. Pictures of her in tights, toe dancing on a horse's back. And in all these photographs, she resembled Louise. Yes, there was the same haggard face with high cheekbones and petulant lips, the same full-bosomed, broad-hipped figure, the same sensual, drooping eyelids. 30 years ago, my landlady had been another Louise, and when I realized this, what little affection I had for the girl faded. Although I continued to ply her assiduously with compliments, my words no longer had the slightest ring of truth. And as the weeks went by, I came to realize that it would be difficult to escape my environment. Daily a web of attachment took place. Both these women regarded me now with an air of ownership. To Madame Fabienne, I was a living embodiment of one to whom she had given the last dying sparks of passion. To Louise, I was a companion of childhood, suddenly transformed into a fairy prince who had crossed the seas to win her. And I? Why, struggle as I might to free myself, my feet were sinking in the quicksand. A month passed, and I had not sold a single piece of work. Where could I go? I was penniless and in debt. Contrary to my expectations, my miniatures went begging. These imaginative figures which I had sold so easily in Paris, these weird gargoyles, nymphs and satyrs, were shuddered at, but never bought. I found myself battering my head against an obstinate, senseless wall of optimism. The beauty which lurks in ugliness, the transcending horror depicted in my works, the morbid terror which enwrapped those tiny figures, all was quite lost on the stupid, smiling people who passed me by. They hurried on, these people, hurried on through the tunnel of life unheedingly, looking neither up nor down, quite immersed in their own bright dreams, and unwilling to contemplate the stern, austere countenance of art. I might have gone on for centuries in my garret, starving, creating, and quite unnoticed, were it not for that group, the happy family. At last my affairs reached a climax. I could no longer avoid fate. I married Louise. Yes, loathing her with all my soul, seeing her a future Madame Fabienne, I married her. It came about like this. One afternoon, while I was at work, a knock sounded on my door. It was Louise. The night before she had heard me express a wish for a female model. She had come to offer her services. Yes, she was quite willing to pose for me. It was no trouble at all. She would be ready in a moment now. With brazenness even for a professional model, she began to disrobe. I attempted to detain her. I put my hand on her arm, but she only kissed me and called me a foolish boy. "Are we not already as good as married?" said she. I did not realize how truly she spoke until I looked over her shoulder and saw Madame Fabienne standing in the doorway. I was positive that something was about to happen. My landlady, among her other accomplishments, had at one time been a melodramatic tragedienne. On her face was mirrored the role which she was about to play. "So," she cried in a voice which squeaked like a violin out of tune, "so I find you thus. Is this how you will repay me, Renee? Has it not been enough to live here week after week, to take board and lodging from me gratis, to receive from my hands all the attention of a mother, without attacking the virtue of my daughter? No, don't attempt to explain away your guilt. Thank God my eyes can still be trusted. Louise, go to your room. I will talk to this young man alone." 15 minutes later, all was over. I had agreed to marry Louise on the following day. That old virago had so battered me with words that my brain was reeling. I would have signed my death warrant to have gotten rid of her. And she, when the victory had been won, when my promise had been gained, immediately relapsed into a sickly, sentimental air. She pinched my cheek and lavished me with endearments. She called me her own beautiful boy. She bade Louise fetch a bottle of Madeira from the cellar and pledged my health in the sweet wine till her eyes grew misty and her voice sounded dull and indistinct. And I? Why, I bowed and smiled and kept on bowing and smiling, till I felt like a mechanical doll attached to a giant's finger, and the smile seemed to grow and grow, till it covered my face with painful, agitated wrinkles, and my head grew heavy and bulbous, so that it became difficult to raise and lower it in time to the old woman's eager, querulous questions. At last they left me to myself. On the following day, Louise and I were married. What a mockery! As the words fell slowly from the priest's mouth, words which weighed me down as though they had been so many pellets of lead, I had a wild impulse to leap to my feet, to shake the girl's hand from my arm, and dash out of that church, never to return. My one cowardly trait, My dread of penury and hunger forced me to remain. And as I knelt before the altar, looking up into the priest's wrinkled face, I became unpleasantly conscious of Madame Fabienne's proximity. I felt her breath fanning the back of my neck. Involuntarily I shuddered, and yet beads of perspiration dotted my forehead. At last the ceremony was over, and we returned home. Home! What a blasphemous title to apply to such a place! And yet the roof sheltered my head. The walls shut out the darkness and the cold. Where else could I find as much, I asked myself. Think of the irony of it. I, a young man of talent, an individualist, an artist, and yet forced to acknowledge such a defeat. It was then I came to the realization that there was something wrong with the world. Surely it had been rolling downhill for ages, a wicked ball bent on destruction. In vain we supermen seek to push it up, to place it on the heights. It evades our eager hands and descends into the black depths. To this day I cannot contemplate its final degradation without a feeling of regret, even of horror. It is not my purpose to dwell too long on my married life. Suffice it to say that it soon became unendurable to me. Living with one woman constantly is prone to wear on the nerves of the sensitive man. But when this woman is lacking in both mentality and feeling, artistic appreciation and higher aspirations, she becomes a burning coal of agony, which one is forced to hold to one's bare breast. Before a week had passed, I hated Louise, as I had never thought to hate any human being. What made it worse, the girl positively adored me. She gave me no peace. She would break into my studio while I was at work and shower me with loathsome caresses. I had no solitude of the soul so necessary to an artist. She sought to occupy every cranny of my life. If I reprimanded her, if, driven to desperation, I struck her, waves of hysterics would follow. Hysterics, that abomination of woman. And to avoid this shrieking inferno, it was necessary for me to calm her with kisses and protestations of affection. Then there was Madame Fabienne. Madame Fabienne with her fishy eyes. How her tongue clattered. I have often thought that she must have assassinated my father with it. Life was still strong in this bag of old bones. It shone evilly out of her bitter blue eyes. It spoke volubly through her dry, shriveled lips. She might live 20 years more, live and persecute me. One night, an inspiration touched me. The inspiration of the happy family. True perception springs from contrast. It has always been my experience that in the city one can visualize the country with an acute clarity. So it is with all things. The musician composes a dirge on a bright spring day. The starving poet writes an ode to sparkling wine and luscious fruit. Thus it was in my case. From a confirmed unbeliever in marriage, I could now see the joys of wedlock. My own unfortunate affair had conjured up in my mind an ideal picture of wedded bliss. A happy family, united in thought and deed, a silent, happy family, who found mere speech unnecessary to a complete mental understanding. And as I sat at dinner listening to the shrill voices of the women, watching their distorted mouths and glistening eyes, in an instant it became apparent what made them so hideous, so revolting. It was life that marred them, hot, noisy life which twisted them into repellent shapes, life which made them detestable and unforgivable. As statues, deprived of breath, motion, speech, they would no longer cause me any pain. On the contrary, I might be proud of them. Madame Fabienne could very well have been Rodin's courtesan, alive, clothed, and speaking. Such ugliness was beautiful in art. It was only when it stepped down from its pedestal that it became loathsome and degraded. And Louise, if she would not speak in that whining tone, if her face could always remain calm and placid, if she could be placed in an artistic posture with her chin resting on her hand, why, she would be beautiful. And then, in my imagination, I saw them as statues, saw them sitting there, silent, white, and beautiful, saw them sitting on a pedestal, united and peaceful, cleansed of life's impurities, quietly waiting for the children yet unborn. I saw the happy family. Why was it not possible to make them so? The few drops of poison in their coffee, and life would quickly fade away. And then, why, then I would carry them up to my studio, where I had so often worked before. But this time I would not work in vain. No, I would make statues of them, enclose them in a special preparation of clay, which might last through all the centuries. Their bodies would not be composed in such a covering. It would be easy. Perhaps I could sell them to an art dealer. At this thought I laughed aloud. "Why are you laughing, René?" asked Madame Fabienne, with one of her quick, suspicious looks. "I was thinking of what an excellent statue you would make, Mamma. May I use you for a model?" She shook her bony head at me like an old vulture. "Careful, René, careful," she mumbled. "Don't bite the hand that feeds you. Youth should respect age." "But I was in earnest, Mamma," I assured her. Bah! She rose and hobbled off on her cane, leaving Louise to wash up the dinner things. For the moment, I was free. Telling my wife that I had to post a letter, I put on my hat and left the house. When I returned, I had a small vial of poison in my waistcoat pocket. As I lay beside Louise that night, I dreamed peacefully of the happy family. Have you ever considered what a childishly simple thing it is to take a human life? We are all so trusting with our fellows, so guileless and trusting, that when the murderous hand reaches out to cut the cord of existence, we stand blinking our eyes stupidly, quite unable to realize the danger. If it were not for the bodies of his victims, bodies which, although silent, bear unfaltering testimony to the truth, the assassin might stalk unmolested through the world. Our immortality seems so assured to us that we seldom question the eyes of those who may have it in their keeping. Louise and her mother suspected nothing. On the following evening, when I suggested that I prepare their coffee in a manner new to them, a method which I had picked up in Paris, they assented readily. It was only when I placed the 2 steaming cups upon the table that any difficulty arose. "I should not drink any coffee," said Madame Fabienne, shaking her head sorrowfully. I felt a sudden flicker of fear. "Why not, Mamma?" I murmured, bending over her solicitously. "It keeps me awake at night. I cannot sleep when I drink coffee." I could not refrain from smiling. "Never fear, Mamma," I answered reassuringly. "This coffee is so prepared that you will not be troubled by insomnia. I guarantee that you will sleep soundly tonight, very soundly." And then, without hesitation, without fear, almost without taking breath, these two women drank their poisoned coffee. I watched them with a calm, impersonal curiosity. And yet the next few moments were the most embarrassing moments of my life. I felt that I was conversing with spectres. Everything I said rang out of tune. I attempted to joke, and my witticisms fell far below humour. I attempted to laugh, and my own familiar laugh sounded as hoarse and guttural as the cawing of a crow. These two women seemed like stiff, formal strangers who could not in any way be amused. Madame Fabienne was the first to go. One side of her shriveled face drew up into knots, as though a cord in her cheek had been suddenly pulled. She clapped her hand to her stomach. "Oh," she cried, "I suffer. I, get the doctor. Get the—" She rolled to the floor and lay there kicking and clawing like a wounded wildcat. Louise rose and bent over her. "Minnie, run out and get Dr. Melbourne," she called over her shoulder in an agitated voice. I had no desire to see them die. A wanton taste for cruelty has never been one of my characteristics. I quitted the room and, mounting the stairs to my studio, spent a few peaceful moments over a cigar. When I returned to the dining room, I found both women dead. Louise's body lay across her mother's. Her upturned face wore an expression of amazement. It was as though I had given her a sudden surprise. Then the real work began. That night I toiled like a galley slave. I carried the bodies up to my studio, I disrobed them, I burned the clothing piecemeal, and then I commenced my famous group, the Happy Family. With the firm, sure hand of an artist, I enclosed them in clinging garments of clay. I gave them immortal skins which might last through all eternity. And now that the life had gone out of them, these women were no longer repulsive to me. No, on the contrary, I felt a sensation of ennobling pride as I busied myself about them, placing them on the pedestal, making of them enduring works of art. When the sun finally peered in at me through the blind, two statues confronted me, two statues so lifelike, so virile, that the hand of Rodin himself could not have done better. My work enraptured me. At last I had created something which might live. What a contrast was this! Madame Fabienne, so thin and withered, cowering in the early light, and beside her, Louise, so strong and buxom, her chin resting in the hollow of her hand. This was art. For the first time in my life I loved them. I was so proud of them that it was all I could do to refrain from running out into the street and bringing back with me the first passer-by to see what I had done. For the moment I was living on the sunlit heights of great achievement. Unfortunately, the artist is never satisfied with his first creation. He must go on and on, enlarging his original conception, until sometimes it winds itself about him like a many-membered octopus and sucks the life out of him. So it was with me. For a week I busied myself in the studio, constructing a large pedestal for my statues. But at the end of that time, I found myself longing to add to the group. What was a happy family without children, I asked myself. A mother-in-law and a wife were all very well, but surely without tender human plants sprouting up about them, they were meaningless and thrown away. Yes, both were lonely and must have childish company. A longing look on Louise's face touched my heart. It was shortly after this that I began to visit the park. With bags of candy in my pocket, I soon made friends with a multitude of children. Finally, I selected two rosy-cheeked little dears, a boy and a girl of 4 and 5, who seemed worthy to join the happy family. By promises of sweets beyond their wildest dreams, I enticed them to my house one afternoon. The rest was easy. 2 sticks of peppermint, the vial, and that night, cleansed and beautiful, white and spotless, turned into tiny statues, they knelt at Louise's feet. Another week of blissful contemplation went by, and then the loneliness on Louise's face again caused me an acute pain. Madame Fabienne, of course, was perfectly content to sit silent in the sunlight, with her grandchildren about her. But Louise was still young, still imbued with thoughts of love, still desirous of male companionship. She must have a husband. It was necessary that I procure her one. And indeed, the happy family would be complete. One afternoon, as I sat pondering in my studio, the doorbell rang. When I answered it, I found a tall, good-looking young man on the stoop. Evidently fate was again playing into my hand. This young man would make an ideal husband for Louise. I could not refrain from smiling as I stood aside and bade him enter. "Is this Madame Fabienne's house?" he asked, stepping into the hallway. "Yes." "Is she at home? May I see her?" "No, she has gone to the country for a month," I murmured. "She may be away even longer." I shrugged my shoulders. "Well," said the young man, eyeing me suspiciously, "I have a warrant to search the house. I am a police officer. See this?" He threw back his coat, disclosing a metal badge. In spite of myself, my voice was a trifle unsteady when I spoke. "But why do you wish to search the house?" "For evidence," the young man answered. "Several children have been kidnapped lately. 2 of them were seen entering this house." He pushed past me and began mounting the stairs. I followed him. My heart was beating wildly, but my face, I feel convinced, was as expressionless as a bare wall. As he searched the different rooms on the 2nd floor, it became quite clear to me that I was perfectly safe. How could he suspect my statues of concealing what he sought? Soon I would lead him to my studio, and thus divert all suspicion from the happy family. And afterwards, when he had found nothing, I would offer him a cooling drink of my own concoction, a drink which would contain an everlasting sleeping potion. Already I could see him on the pedestal beside Louise, a silent, loving husband. "If you are ready," I said to the young man, "I will show you my studio. I am a sculptor. You will find children there, but they are only statues." He ignored my pleasantry and merely nodded. He was a very brusque young man. "Show me to your studio," he said. I conducted him to it in silence. Opening the door, I stood aside and motioned him to enter. My heart was now beating calmly and evenly. No fear lurked in my soul. I would show this young man my statues, and perhaps he would appreciate what art could do. I was introducing him to his future family. Soon he would be sitting there, white, motionless, and smiling. He looked about the room carelessly, and finally his eyes became fixed on the statues. Good," he muttered, "damnably good." And then turning to me with a new respect, he said, "I had an ambition to become a sculptor myself. I studied at school, but couldn't make a go of it. I know enough about the game, though, to realize how good these are. Rodin himself wouldn't be ashamed of that old woman. What do you call this group?" "The Happy Family," I answered. "The Happy Family?" he repeated thoughtfully. "They don't look very happy, any of them. They look as if they had just been surprised by something, unpleasantly surprised. Take that old woman, for instance. She looks—" "Nonsense," I broke in angrily. "They are happy. Happy." This young man's stupidity began to aggravate me. In life they would have been loathsome and repulsive, but here, look at this old woman. I approached and put my hand proudly on her shriveled shoulder. "She's a masterpiece, she—" "Look out!" cried the detective suddenly. "Look out, she's falling." I uttered a cry of horror and clutched at Madame Fabienne, but it was too late. Unconsciously, I had leaned my full weight for an instant on her shoulder. And now, swaying once or twice, she was falling forward. In vain I sought to clasp her in my arms, to shield her body with mine. She bore me over backwards, and we both came toppling to the floor. The plaster covering her face was broken into 1,000 bits, and then the head of Madame Fabienne, the head with its ghastly grin and glassy eyes, like some evil jack-in-the-box, popped out into the sunlight. I remembered nothing more. The room, the detective, the statues were swallowed up in blackness. I fainted. When I regained consciousness, it was to find myself jolting through the streets on my way to prison. It is morning. Already the grey light of dawn is sifting through the window. My task is over. I have told you faithfully the story of the Happy Family. And now that the tale is told, now that the time grows short, I want to impress upon you, the reading public, you who have become so interested in my fate, that I, René Gallien, I am not afraid of death. Tomorrow they may lie about me in the papers. They may say I had to be carried to the chair, that I wept, that I pleaded, that I even prayed. But you, my admirers, my friends, my brothers, shall not believe them. No, I only fear something which lurks on the invisible frontier, something which is approaching steadily and relentlessly. What is this something? I do not know, but it is not death. No, it is not death. The end of Silent, White and Beautiful by Tod Robbins.